First up, apologies if I sound a little bit like Barry White. I picked a bit of illness in the last couple of weeks, which I'm going over the back end of. And secondly, can I offer you all a season's greetings? It's only 6 days as I record this before the big day. I won't get another opportunity to do it, so can I wish each and every one of you a happy holiday? For context, which will probably come as a surprise to absolutely no one, I'm a bit of a Grinch when it comes to Christmas. I didn't have that many great ones growing up, and I've spent a 20-year career essentially often seeing the worst side of Christmas. But I'm also cognizant of the massive positives that come with it. I'm a dad myself. I know how important Christmas is and be formative to younger ones. So genuinely, my Grinchness aside, I hope this year that you get all you need and all you deserve out of Christmas. Which actually sounds a bit threatening. Maybe I should have found another way to say that. Anyway, happy Christmas. Although ostensibly this is the ZYKLISCH production video, brilliant word, means cycle for those of you who haven't researched it on what do German words mean.net. These video notes are a bit of a hybrid in terms of some comments on the TOD story. I suppose in my head I haven't quite nailed yet whether the long testimony videos are short stories or something different. I kind of feel like they are, which is why I've been describing them as short stories, but at the same time, I don't really feel they deserve their own production notes. So that's why I kind of half tag them onto these ones. Some of you, the more loyalist ones, will probably have seen a post where I said that I'd read a book recently about captured aircraft in the service of the Luftwaffe. And the picture that book painted was that it was far from uncommon for pilots, fighter and bomber pilots, operating over the English Channel to become lost because of the weather or because they didn't have enough navigation time and land on the wrong airfield. And sometimes that airfield was in the wrong country. And this was how about half of the 20 or so working Spitfires that the Luftwaffe inherited came to be in their possession. There were a couple that the British had given to the French in 1939, which were on French airfields, which weren't destroyed because of the speed of the German advance, and they fell into German hands. There were a couple that crash landed with only minor damage, and they were repaired. There are so many on both sides. I mean, you lose track of the number of fighters and bombers that landed in the UK that were German, that I think I'm going to have to do a factual video on it further down the line. But for the purposes of this, I just want to touch on the story of, I suppose, the one that most influenced Todd, the story of an aircraft that became known as the Messerschmitt. On the morning of November 18th, 1942, a pair of Spitfires from 131 Squadron crossed the Channel from the UK to carry out a raid deep in French territory. These planes were flown by two Free French officers, Pilot Officer Bernard Scheidauer and Pilot Officer Henri de Bordas. Apologies for the pronunciation in advance. Upon crossing the French coast, the two pilots headed up the Caen to Cherbourg railway line, strafing a number of targets as they did so. But as they approached the Carentan area, obviously made famous by Band of Brothers, there was a heavy carpet of flak and the two planes got separated, with de Bordas eventually deciding to abandon the mission when he couldn't reacquire his partner. Elsewhere, Scheidauer had also turned away for home, but his Spitfire had sustained flak damage and he had a significant fuel loss rate. Disorientated, he headed west, believing he was heading north, and when he caught sight of what he believed was a large island, he crash landed in a field there, believing and hoping it was the Isle of Wight. He was a bit disappointed then when a number of locals who approached him told him he'd actually landed on Jersey, which was occupied by the Germans. The young French pilot spent the next 20 minutes trying to damage the Spitfire as best he could. He smashed the instrument panel. He tried to get the locals to take various items away with them, which they were reluctant to do. And he was trying to ignite the fuel where the Germans arrived 20 minutes later and captured him. On assessing the Spitfire, Luftwaffe technicians decided that they could repurpose it. They stripped out the engine and fitted a Daimler-Benz to it, and they fitted a propeller from a Messerschmitt 109 to it. And that Spitfire, the Messerschmitt, was used as a training and familiarisation aid for Luftwaffe pilots for the next 2 years. It went on tours of French and German airfields. A number of their pilots used it to understand how it was superior to their own aircraft. And eventually it was damaged beyond repair in an American bomber raid in August of 1944 and sent for scrap. The story of Pilot Officer Scheidauer doesn't end there, and it is a sad one, in that he was one of the 76 officers who would later participate in the mass escape from the German POW camp Stalagluft 111, which was specifically for RAF pilots. This is the event that the movie The Great Escape is based on. So he was one of 76 officers who managed to escape. The ending of that story, and again I might do a video on this, is that 50 were recaptured, and Hitler was so incensed by the act and determined to prevent future escapes that he ordered that they be killed. And they were all taken away in groups of 4 by the Gestapo and shot and cremated, and their remains sent back to the RAF camp. After the war, there was a great effort to try and locate some of the criminals who'd done this. Some were found, some were already dead. A real story of hope and depression in equal measure. Moving backwards through the mists of time to the events of ZYKLISCH, love that word. I've said in a number of previous production videos that some of the sequels or sidequels I've ended up doing, there was never any plan for them at the time I wrote the original. For this, quite the opposite's true, and if anything, I ended up writing the whole story in reverse, as I should have done this before I did Brooke, really. The conceit was always going to be, and a lot of people have used or equated it to a Twilight Zone story, and I suppose they're right, really, in that whatever the Germans do in the 1940s causes an unbroken causality cycle back in World War One. And I suppose that's something I also touched on in the production notes for Juncture. Quite annoying that I've inadvertently done 2 time travel stories back to back. I don't like doing that, but it's happened. Move on. The idea being that if you go back in time and you commit an act, then surely that act is then locked in. That's it. It's happened then. It can't be changed. You can't prevent it from happening. Those circumstances then dictate how you go back in time to commit that act. So you can't just go back and do something different, because how could you go back if you change the past? You can't change the past. It's happened. So for Brooke, the Germans inadvertently, or maybe advertently, send Joe Jr. back to 1918, and he saves his dad's life. And in doing so, he drops the gun, which his dad then has to give to him in the 1940s in order to fulfill that cycle. And that's going to happen. The gun, I suppose, is the marker point in history. By son passing the gun to father, they then lock that and it can't be changed. No one can go back and change that. The son's always going to end up going back in time to save his dad, and his dad's always going to end up giving him the gun to do that. I guess the only question in my head is, where's the gun come from? And I haven't quite figured that one out yet, to be honest. It actually proved really hard to write Brooke under the constraint of knowing it was a 2-parter and to not give away too many spoilers. Because to do it, I had to quite vigorously undersell Joe Sr. as hard as I could, just turn him into a 2-dimensional character, bit of a nasty dad, uncaring, and try and not foreshadow what was going to happen with the overall plot. I think it worked. I don't know how much of a surprise or a shock it was when it was revealed what happened across the 2 stories. You know, as always, you guys be the judge, you tell me. In terms of Joe Jr. and his overall fate, if you're a devoted and regular viewer of the testimonials, then you'll know that the answer has already been teased. That knock at the door at the end of the story is a good news scenario in some format, and that's as far as I'll take it. One of the more quirky developments the channel's seen, which was never part of the planning stage, was the importance of colour to some of the plot elements. This is something that myself and Sean have both, I suppose, naturally progressed or discussed over time. with the idea that for each different strand of the paranormal, there's a different colour associated with it that sets it out distinct from the others. So you'll have noticed that for the time travel experiments and the tech involved, there's always a purple fog or a purple light whenever that happens. And this is a wider phenomenon that is going to be used in a couple of time travel stories, some of which aren't necessarily associated. Just have to understand that when it happens, something purple happens. Does that sound silly? I suppose it does. Whereas for the UFO storylines, there's a distinctly yellow feel to everything in terms of the colour of the object itself, which was something that Sean came up with, and the power and the energy it produces is distinctly different to whatever tech is going on in the time travel stories. And then moving aside from that, if you look at the supernatural stories, most of which involve Major Horst Stark, everything's green, from the fire of the human suicide bombers to the jewel he uses to avoid assassination. The supernatural, the magical elements, use green as a colour. And the idea here is that there are different operations or different factions working behind the scenes in the Reich. And you can distinguish them depending on what colour they're using. But ultimately, there's probably going to be some overlap between them, or some collaboration as the war comes to its closing stages. And one of the stories behind that is the fact that you end up with these different German officers, some of whom you've already met from different work streams or workflows, working together in South America at the end of hostilities. Anyway, 2023 feels like it's been a fairly good year. Certainly been improvement on the ones that have come before it. The deal between Bedtime Stories and Borland has had an impact on my ability to write. I can't do it as regularly. I have to prioritise the Bedtime Story stuff. But I think the trade-off there is that there's increased viewership across the channels, and that's a positive thing. The new year should open up with the last couple of shorts for Purgatory. And then I've agreed with Sean that we've had sufficient time now to revisit Bez, which was the Russian storyline, which I sidelined because I didn't think it was appropriate to publish at the time because of what was going on wider. As always, the only reason I do this, the only reason I log in, the only reason I write these and publish them anymore is for you guys, really. There's about a couple of hundred of you, and the feedback and the praise that you send me for it, it just keeps me wanting to do more and to improve. I'd probably given up by now, to be honest, if it wasn't for you. Anyway, I hope you all have a great Christmas, a great New Year. I look forward to seeing you all on the other side.